So yes, we can begin. So hello everyone and welcome. Thank you for joining our session. My name's Jamie Kendrick. I'm Editor-in-Chief of the Green European Journal. And we're delighted to be here at the European Greens Council today to have a discussion around our brand new print edition, Democracy Ever After. This latest edition looks at the state of democracy and representation in Europe today. And one of the starting points for the discussion is that democracy is not static, it's always evolving, it's always changing. And the direction which it evolves in is both very important and is always a matter of political debate and political context. So the edition features articles, interviews, and lots of other kind of content too, on topics ranging from building an inclusive politics through feminism in Finland, to looking at how the populist politics of the far right changes democracy as we know it. We also explore how the climate and ecological crisis interact with our democracies. And then we look at the many forms of democratic engagement of Europe today, from citizens' assemblies to the growing use of referendums, both for good and for bad. So if you're interested in reading the new edition, I encourage you to visit the Green European Journal website at greeneuropeanjournal.eu, where all our content's freely available online. Or if you prefer to read in paper, you can also order or subscribe for a small shipping fee. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our three speakers today, who all contributed to the recent edition. Coming from three different countries and three different realities in terms of democratic politics, Switzerland, Hungary, and France. We'll have a discussion on the different trends around the future of democracies in Europe, what we can learn from experiences of deepening democracy and inclusion and participation in politics, and what proposals can be made to steer democracy towards those ends. So I'd like to start off by introducing Florian Irminger. Florian is Secretary General of the Swiss Green Party. From 2008 to 2012, he was elected member of the Constituent Assembly that wrote a new constitution for the Canton of Geneva. And he was also previously Director of Penal Reform International and Head of Advocacy for the Human Rights House Foundation. So thank you for joining us, Florian. I would also like to introduce Kata Benedict. Kata is a Hungarian art historian and a journalist. She's a PhD candidate at the Free University in Berlin, and her work revolves around queer cultural history in Central and Eastern Europe. So thank you for joining us. I would also, maybe just to say that Florian and Kata both contributed to a series in the edition about the uses and misuses of referendums today in Europe, which, as well as being a reflection on referendums as a form of democratic politics, is also a way into looking at different national politics and their democracies today. And the final speaker that I'd like to introduce is Helen Landamar. Helen's a political theorist at Yale University, interested in democratic theory, Enlightenment thinkers, and the philosophy of social sciences. And her latest book is Open Democracy, Reinventing Popular Rule for the 21st Century. And we featured an interview of Helen on her new book as part of the edition. So thank you all for joining us. We'll start now with a discussion that will last around 45 minutes. Feel free to add questions in the chat as we go, and then otherwise we'll open up for discussions at the end. So I'd maybe like to start just by asking you, Helen, about your new book, Open Democracy, because you call it a new paradigm for democracy in the 21st century, suggesting that we might be moving towards a more open kind of democracy. So could you just explain what you mean by that?
Yes, of course. Thank you for having me, first of all. It's a pleasure to be here. So what I mean by an open democracy, it's a democracy that revolves around the ordinary citizen as opposed to professional elected elites. So I propose it as a sort of a, Copernican revolution of sorts. And the idea in it is to make the center of power, which I associate with the legislative power, as accessible to ordinary citizens as possible. So it's not a model of direct democracy in the sense that I don't believe that we can legislate en masse all the time together on every possible issue. There needs to be some division of labor and some delegation of power. But what we can aim for is something I call representing and being represented in turn, meaning all of us should be able at some point in our life to be making the law for the rest of us. And in order for this to be possible, I think we have to accept and realize, first of all, that elections are not the way to get to that sort of ideal. Elections by construction, by design, distribute power unequally. We know that since, we've known that since Aristotle, and it's a lesson that Montesquieu, Rousseau, and more recently people like Bernard Manin have been repeating, but somehow we still haven't quite gotten it. And in my book, I'm trying to, it took me a long time myself to come to this realization, but really, as long as we are stuck with elections as the primary way of distributing positions of power and political offices, we will be stuck with somewhat oligarchic forms of democracy. And so if we want an authentic democracy, we need to go back to an ancient intuition, which was the idea of distributing power, political offices, and in fact, the power to legislate at random on the basis of strict impartiality and equality, one person, one lottery ticket, such that if you multiply this, kind of lotocratic bodies at all levels of the polity, in your lifetime as an individual, regardless of your education level, your capacity to convince, your skin color, your gender, your partisan views, etc., you'd have a real chance of being part of a lawmaking body, of a body that makes decisions, that makes policy. And there are some benefits to that way of selecting rulers, if you will, which have to do with the benefits of cognitive diversity. When you sort of select people that way, you get a more complete description, more accurate description of the, more accurate representation actually of the interests and perspectives distributed in the entire country. And so that way you make sure that you don't have blind spots and you're able to offer solutions that work for all. So that's roughly the idea. And it's not to say that there wouldn't be direct democracy moments. Of course, you need the legitimacy and the support of the whole population. So the proposals by these lotocratic bodies, as I call them, would have to be put, some of them, maybe not all the time, maybe in bulk, maybe in different ways, to a popular vote. So referenda would be quite common in an open democracy, much more frequent than they are actually under current electoral regimes. And they could come from, the top down. It could be the government deciding they need approval from the people, or it could also be initiated by citizens themselves via things like citizens' initiatives and referrals, rights of referral. So that's globally the view. That's the main difference with what the paradigm we're familiar with, electoral democracy.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. I wanted to bring in Florian because Switzerland actually has one of the most distinctive kinds of democracy in the world. It's quite unique. It's got regular referendums. It's highly federal. So are elements of Switzerland generalizable to other countries, or is it unique, a case amongst itself? What can Swiss experience teach other countries and other democracies?
Yeah, well, thank you. When speaking about the Swiss democracy, I think you just have to start by reframing what we're talking about. We're talking about a tiny little country in the middle of Europe, and a very young democracy. It's a full democracy only for the last 50 years, right? Women gained the right to vote only in 1971. And then we're talking about a concept of a country that comes from 26 cantons who all believe that they're still in some sort sovereign. They all have their own constitution. So we have 27 constitutions translated in 4 official languages, and each language has same value as the other one. and we have 2,172 communes. All of these levels have their own government, their own legislative, and at federal and cantonal level, their own judicial authorities. So once that is said, I don't think you can copy that anywhere else in the world. And I'm not sure that anybody in Switzerland understands why it works, but somehow it does work. I think the most important element that Helen already kind of touched upon is that our democracy, the direct democracy element, is absolutely bottom up. So the right to change the constitution, the right to request that a law that was voted by a parliament comes to a popular referendum, that comes only from the citizens and the cantons. There is no such form of top-down referendum like in France with the president saying, now I want a referendum on the constitutional treaty, on the European constitutional treaty. We don't have that. So there's something almost Rousseauist in this idea that the social pact that the constitution is will really be written by the citizens. And we rewrite the constitution. It's 27 constitutions. We rewrite them all 50, 80 years fully. And the constitution, that's also important, is it has a much stronger political role than in most other countries. It's not just a legal text. It doesn't US model only define the three powers. It really gets kind of the cornerstones of what the political general direction will be. So somehow if the constitution is somewhere on the right, I'm saying this in a simple way, well, the left will be within the framework of that constitution. So what you write in a constitution as missions of the state, as its powers and authority, is really important. And obviously the right to vote for women, for example. Maybe, you know, for people who don't know Switzerland, what do we vote on? We recently had a referendum on an initiative that asked to ban all sorts of covers of the face. We voted on that just recently in March. Although we're all walking around with masks currently, the idea was to ban burqas. So we'll see how they will implement that. But that ban passed. Then, you know, protecting the horns of cows was a referendum recently. The Green Party were the only ones saying that yes vote was necessary. The ban of nuclear energy regularly comes, and we almost won last time, but we're still getting out of nuclear energy. And I said it, the right to vote of women. What is also important is these referendums. The referendums, they don't change the constitution. You can challenge any law passed by parliament. So in a way, your parliamentary system can't just be majority or opposition, because the opposition will be strong enough to gain a referendum. So you have to build an alliance that prevents, if possible, a referendum. And this referendum tool, you know, quite interestingly now, on 13th of June, we'll vote on the first popular referendum on a law implementing the Paris Agreement. We'll have our CO2 law put to referendum. And what is interesting with this is it obliges Parliament to function in a little bit different way. At a very small level, at the communal level even, you can't just do a majority-minority thing. And it also creates a proximity between the citizen and the person who is elected. And these elections that take place every 4 years at the federal level, 4 or 5 years at cantonal level, well, they're important, but somehow the referendums and the regular votes we have every 4 times a year are just as important or even more important. But the most important element, I think, in all of it is our elected officials are in the streets, well, not this year, but normally in the streets trying to convince people of not themselves, but of an idea that they're fighting for, of a proposition that they're in favor, or of a law that they are against. And that creates a public debate sort permanently, and a proximity between citizens. And I should actually say people who live in Switzerland, not only citizens, and the elected officials.
Thank you for that. It's fascinating to hear how it actually functions and how it affects politics. I wanted to bring Kata in now because, well, if we're talking about the democracy in Europe, it's also important to reflect on the European countries where the reality is much different. And And one of the distortions of democracies that we've seen in the past decade is a liberal democracy, which is Viktor Orban's own term for his model of government. You wrote in the edition about how consultations were actually used by the by the Fidesz government to kind of, well, they co-opted them to support their own power. So could you explain a bit more about how this has been used in Hungary?
Well, yeah, democracy and Hungary in the same sentence is always funny these days. However, I think it's worth to mention like two factors that the Fidesz is using in their general politics since 2010, since they got the 2/3 mandate. One is that they basically systematically dismantled the democratic institutions of checks and balances, meaning that these institutions obviously still exist, but their work is biased as most of the higher positions are filled in by Fidesz loyal people. This also includes the National Election Committee, which is responsible or supervises referendums. And the second thing is that they took like a total control over the media in the country. So through these two things, they basically, okay, just about the media part at some point, sorry. Basically, they monopolized political communication in the country. So when we are talking about, I wrote about like agenda setting, but it doesn't start with referendums or consultations. It starts with the past 10 years of constant communication, which excludes debate or any kind of like oppositional ideas or criticism of the party's decision or standpoint. So when they call for the public's opinion on certain matters, it's generally like it's mimicking direct democracy in a way, but obviously it's like biased from the root. And as I wrote, like there was like only one referendum in the past 11 years, which actually failed because of the low participation. But on the other hand, the Fidesz started to do these national consultation surveys, which is always like surrounded by a countrywide propaganda campaign throughout these mediums. Obviously, these are like a very problematic surveys, as there's no regulation over it because it's not a referendum, it mimics a referendum. So there's no regulation or how they formulate the questions, how they distribute the questionnaires, and how they evaluate the results. By formation, I mean that most of these questions are leading questions or complex questions that I would say that anyone who thinks them through, it's impossible to answer. So basically, the people who return it will be the ones who, yeah, it's just like an assumption, are the people who are like blinded by the Fidesz populism. And the results usually are like 90 or 90+% positive answers for the government ideas. In distribution, the first national consultation, I think it was in 2011, they sent out like 2 million of these surveys. Like Hungary has around like 10 million people, 8 million of these people are voters. And in the last ones, it already reached like 8 million. So basically each household got their forms of it. They'd send them out by letters. Actually, I live in Berlin. Once or twice, actually, I got it in my Berlin post box as well. So they do have their reach and they have their information how to reach people. And in the evaluation process, it's not regulated, it's not transparent at all. They don't provide any information about it. They just say a number in the end, like how many percentage of the people who actually replied, how they much support the government's ideas. But also because there's no verification, it's like not even like, basically there's like nothing transparent about the whole process. But in the end, they usually frame the results as like a politically valid number, which legitimizes their performance like in Home Affairs or in the European Union. And there are also other concerns about it. There were signs that these surveys were also used for data collection because I don't know, I think around like 2015, they also started to open like online platforms where they could, like where people could vote. And the verification process there was also not secured. And then some people found some codes in the page, which seems that it transported like this actually sensitive data to Russian servers. And maybe there's a possibility that they benefited from it as well. What else? I think it's worth to mention that the topics of these consultations vary. There were consultations about if Hungary wants to accept terrorists paid by George Soros to invade Hungary. In the newest one, which just happened a couple of months ago, they asked the public opinion how to deal with the COVID pandemic. And online it says like 500,000 people voted that they would like to go to restaurants, and on the bottom of the site it reads that the government is going to include this the results in their decision how to ease the regulations, but again there's no actual obligations to, like, basically it's not clear how these referendums actually contribute to anything. But like the basic idea of these consultations are still about the Fidesz getting legitimization in a numeral form, basically. And it's really not much about people's opinion in the end.
Thanks, Kata. So we've heard a bit about how very top-down forms of consultation can be entirely manipulated. I want to come to you, Helen, to ask something that happened in France over the last couple of years, which has drawn both interest of people interested in climate politics, but also skepticism for its form and the results. And this was the Citizens' Convention on Climate in France. It came after the Gilets Jaunes movement and tried to, I think it set its task to solve France's climate goals in the spirit of social justice through debate and citizens' assembly. So do you think there are lessons that we can learn from the experience in terms of how to do participation in consultation and maybe also how not to?
Yes, of course. I think for me, the main lesson is that we have to stop talking about participation and consultation, and we have to start talking about representation. Which means power, which means giving power, you know, as opposed to supplementing elected institutions, augmenting them, because as long as there's a sort of subordination of these citizens' assemblies to parliament, to the will of the prince, we'll see what happens is that nothing happens. Is that the parliament took what they wanted from the 149 proposals of the 150 citizens, and the bill is not measuring up to the goals of government even in the end. So I think that's what's frustrating, is that as long as we keep talking about this as if it's like a supplement or something that doesn't really challenge fundamentally the structure of our democracies, then I think it's just going to be participation washing. And so my sense is that these citizens' assemblies have enormous potential, but you need to empower them. And empowering them must mean more than making this very ambitious promise at the beginning. You know, Macron told them, I'll submit your proposals, your quasi-legislative proposals, really, because that's what he asked of them, that they co-construct and co-write with experts legislative proposals about how to curb greenhouse gas emissions by 40% of the 1990s levels in a spirit of social justice. And he said, I'll submit them without filtering to either direct regulation, referendum, or a parliamentary debate. In the end, there was a lot of filtering going on. I think 15% of the proposals actually went through without too much changes. The rest was watered down, diluted, etc. So the plus side, the lesson is that if you empower these bodies, you actually tell them what they do is going to matter, They're incredibly energized. They worked very, very hard for over a year. And they delivered. And to my surprise, actually, because I theoretically speaking, I was only convinced of their ability to generate very general agendas, very important one, but still at the general level. And in the French Convention case, I think it's the first time that we have a participatory experiment where citizens are put in the positions of pre-legislators, basically, and they measured up to the occasion. At least that's the argument I would make. And given the constraints of time and everything, it's really, and the fact that it happened, during a pandemic and social movements, it's even more remarkable. So I think we're just, scratching the surface of what citizens are capable of doing, and I'm now fully convinced that they are capable of legislating in many areas, including environmental areas. But again, we saw the main lesson of the French experiment is that if you don't think about how to articulate the input of these bodies with the existing authentically empowered institutions, meaning either government or parliament, then it's just not viable. So if we contrast this with the Irish case of 2012 and 2015 with the Citizens' Assembly on gay marriage and then decriminalization of abortion, respectively, you see that the only reason why it worked is because Parliament was behind this and fully supportive of those assemblies and kind of like pre-committed to the outcome in a way. So then when they organized a referendum based on the recommendations of the citizens' assemblies, and then the majority of the population followed suit and sort of like validated the recommendations of those assemblies. And in the French case, it's really striking to see how fearful the citizens themselves were. They didn't trust the French nation. They chose not to put to a referendum the 149 proposals that they came up with, except those that were about modifying the constitution, but those can't be directly put to a referendum. You need Senate approval and it's unlikely to be obtained. So in the end, they didn't trust their own people. And Parliament felt, because the whole idea was initially Macron's idea, they felt short-circuited. They felt like their legitimacy was under threat, that they basically saw the citizens of the French Convention for Climate as competition for their own legislative power. And so I think that's how they received the proposals as a somewhat of a threat. And so we need to think about ways to be clear about who's doing what with what legitimacy, and so that there's no conflict, but also that they're real power. And as long as these bodies have no legal status, no actual powers, then it's easy to discard them and ignore their recommendations.
Thank you. I saw you want to come in there, Florian. So come in, please.
Just more as an anecdotal element, since we're at the European Green Congress. One of the people who was chosen in the lottery was Kata Benedict to serve on the council in France, and then he said he will not do it. But it's quite interesting because it underlines that an argument often brought is this lottery process. You never know who it is. All these incompetent people will be elected into or chosen, and there you go for a climate environment lottery system. You have Kata Benedict being chosen out. So just to say anecdotally, probably these citizens are very capable of doing these kind of things. And I'll talk about Switzerland.
I would like to bring you in on Switzerland now because Helen finished up by talking about the articulation between different forms of power, and I wanted to say from the perspective of a political party, the Swiss Green Party operates in a system with referendums, with a different logic to the normal cycle of elections. I mean, you mentioned it a little bit before, but how does it affect your political work? And are there particular things that you'd like to see improved, or does it work for the Swiss Greens operating in this kind of system?
Well, again, Switzerland is so particular. So let me just say that the Swiss Greens are the only Swiss political party that is present at executive and legislative level in almost all cantons, not executive in almost all cantons, but in 7 of the 26. But we're the only party that is not present in the Swiss government. So keep that in mind, that the Social Democrats and the far right wing are together in a government that is not a usual system of alliance to govern, right? It's just everybody gets into government. That's how the Swiss system has been until the Greens arrived. And now there is a sort of conservative Green Party that has been emerging last 10 years that also isn't in government, but they're way smaller than us. But let me follow up on what Helen said, because I think it's quite interesting with what we are trying to do. We are seeing the limits of this system for us, where we're unable to win, for example, an initiative that needs a majority of cantons, 26, as I said. Many of them are quite small cantons with 30,000 plus minus residents. And we need a majority of cantons and a majority of people. So the system the Swiss system is not made so that progressive ideas can come through. It's built up by what we call the Grand Old Party. It's not the GOP, it's the conservatives in Switzerland who built the system in order to maintain power. It didn't work out that well for them in the last half a century. But we're promoting more democracy. And when I say more democracy, I'll just start with this. We are pushing for the creation of a sort of climate council that will be modeled on the parliament with 200 members, but would have sort of legislative power. So with the idea that there wouldn't be, like we saw in France, this top-down process that can block their propositions, but that it is really bottom-up, that they can choose what they want to bring to parliament, where as citizens they want to empower a process. And it's interesting because we try to say that's what can come in parallel to the direct democracy and the representative democracy that we have. And we try to defend the idea, but we're very lonely on this in Switzerland. But we also say other things, like our direct democracy is very old-fashioned. You have to go in the street and get signatures on a piece of paper, and you have to then collect 100,000 signatures, valid signatures that then you have to send to all of these 2,100 communes so that they validate that these people are indeed citizens who have the right to vote. So the process is extremely heavy and old-fashioned. So we're trying to digitalize it, use more online tools, and we're trying to change the framework of it to allow that. I spoke about the double majority that is needed. It's a majority that favors rural areas in a country that lives in quite a lot in small cities, but still cities. And then we have two major problems. The first one is that about 20% of the people who live in Switzerland don't have a Swiss passport, and that acquiring a Swiss nationality is extremely difficult and expensive. So people can live here for 40 plus years, not become Swiss. People can give birth to their children here who don't become Swiss. And those people who are born here and don't become Swiss because it's expensive and difficult can give birth to children who don't become Swiss. So we have a 3-generation thing, people who live here and don't become Swiss. So we're trying to push this in saying a true direct democracy is not only one where also Swiss women have the right to vote, but it is also one where people who have been living here for ages, who are born here, also have the right to participate to direct democracy. Because in fact, the direct democracy is a democracy that is reserved for 3/4 of the people living here. Again, we're quite lonely on that, and we're trying to push it from 18 to 16. Now, why are we trying to do the voting age from 18 to 16? Why are we trying to do all of that? It's because with this climate generation that we're seeing, with the young people mobilizing, our slow and old-fashioned direct democracy tools are quite frustrating for them. Now they mobilized in 2019, created a climate wave in a way in this country with the largest political shift that ever happened in favor of the Green Party, that ever happened in Switzerland in favor of the Green Party. And yet we only have the CO2 law now. It will come to the people, but things are very slow. And our fear is that the direct democracy being so slow and old-fashioned will actually disabuse the younger generation will disabuse people who live here and who don't have the feeling that they have access to this direct democracy. And that's a true danger for democracy, and for a system that needs participation. So you were asking more about what does it mean for a political party? Well, I think the big difference between the Swiss Greens, and I'll end with this, compared to other political parties, is that we are much more a campaigning tool, a little bit like an NGO. We have to build up campaigns every 3 months on a specific theme. We have to specialize on those themes. Right now, we're campaigning hard for 2 anti-pesticide initiatives, and that makes it that the people who are elected are their election is important. Obviously, the work in Parliament has high importance, but it's not the only thing we do. And we can compensate what doesn't happen in Parliament through what can happen through direct democracy and the other way around. But there are risks associated to all of that. Probably we'll come back to that.
Thank you very much. I wanted to bring Kata back in, and some of the words we've used, such as representation and exclusion. I mean, we see in a liberal democracy that it's got the very opposite of that, or at least it claims to represent a very limited understanding. It's often anti-migrant, homophobic, misogynist as well. So do you see avenues to kind of counter this very exclusionary form of a liberal democracy with a more inclusive politics?
Well, the first thing should be to remove the Fidesz from power to actually help anything to progress. But even if they would change something in their communication or inclusion in decision processes, they could also just start with listening to professional or civil organizations, which they also don't do. The ministries obviously have the capacities to consult with a broader range of people, even like civilians, civil organizations or professional organizations, worker unions, which they don't do. And the second part could be more democratic access to contribute for the general public. But that will probably take, even if they would start to change from tomorrow, it would take probably years or even decades to re-educate people how to actually voice their opinions. Because apart from the institutionalized exclusion, they also use, basically they built out extremely a vertical and horizontal network of dependency, which is both economical and power dependency in a way, which we can also just call corruption, which goes from prime minister's office to owner of a national tobacco shop in a 300 people town, which also created this the network of non-official surveillance where people don't even voice their opinions in smaller professional circles because they are afraid of the consequences, especially in the public sector, which is obviously financed and supported by the government. Examples could be brought from any field of Hungarian public life. They change, they do institutional or budget changes without consulting with anyone, talking about hospitals, they will never ask the doctors. Talking about scholarly discourses, they just cut the budget where they want to, without any open discourses. I think actually in the past few months, maybe there's a bit more of willingness to put out their politicians in public, which many sees as the system is cracking. Well, we told it many times in the past 11 years and it's still there. But there might be a tiny chance of, especially because elections are coming up next year again. Maybe there will be a change now because also it took a good couple of years for independent media to reestablish itself, and now they actually have a bit bigger visibility than before, and they became more professional. They create more content, which is also they do a lot of investigative journalism. They interview a lot of people. They actually give the platform to those people who are not voiced by the government. So all these things together, maybe there's a bit of change even now, but for like a fundamental change, we definitely need a change in the power structure of mainstream politics.
It's a question of who's holding the reins. Just for participants, if you're interested in reading more on what Kata was saying at the end, we have a piece in the edition that's also on independent media in Central Europe, and how, despite their difficulties, that they in recent years they have actually been strengthening. So I encourage you to read that if you're interested. I wanted to finish with a more forward-looking and kind of speculative round, and maybe start with you, Helen, because I've read your book, Open Democracy, and it finishes by thinking about, well, it's been tried in France, could it work internationally, globally? So do you see chances for kind of more open forms of democracy beyond the national level? And what do you make of the conference on the future of Europe? Is that a general chance for citizens' engagement, or not really?
I'd like to be optimistic about the Conference for the Future of Europe. I really want to, and I think it's something that is a beginning of something interesting that probably should have been tried 30 years ago. But so let me say a few words that are positive about this. I think it's basically copied on the Great National Debate, the French Great National Debate that preceded the Convention for Climate, and it has some of its qualities and some of its flaws. So the qualities are that it's really an effort to be somewhat bottom up, to try to listen to the entire European population by multiplying participatory formats. So you have an online platform, which is not very good because it's, again, not deliberative. They sort of made the same mistake that the French government made. There is an effort to reproduce the model of citizen panels, groups of randomly selected citizens, about 100 each, I think, which are transnational. So that's really promising, and I'm sure very interesting conversations are going to take place there. You have all these self-organizing meetings. And also, I think one thing that's very positive is that they really opened up the topics. So in France, they restricted it to 4 issues that the government felt comfortable letting French people talk about, but they excluded other very important themes like immigration. It seems that it's not the case in those conversations about the future of Europe. Everything seems to be on the table from what I read, and that's really good. So that could be amazing. But my sense is that the European structure is the constitutional constraints are so strong that whatever good comes out of it will be dissipated as soon as it's a question of implementing it. So I'm very worried about the impact of this, right? Even if it has an impact, even if it has a visibility, which currently doesn't seem to be the case. I'm not hearing much echo of those conversations, unfortunately. What's going to happen to the output, right? In France, a lot of people complain that it was unclear, that the government picked and chose, that it was also very hard to synthesize and make sense of all these formats in a way that was sort of like representative and meaningful. I think the conversation about the future of Europe will run into the same problem, and because there was no pre-commitment on the part of any significant figure that any of this would matter, I'm a bit worried, I have to say. So actually, I'm not looking necessarily to open democracy at the European level anytime soon. If it's likely to happen, it's much more likely to happen potentially in countries where they have reached a level of despair about the electoral system that is much deeper. I'm thinking of potentially African countries where it's just corruption and clientelism. So if there is a social change and they want to rewrite their constitution, they might want to write in something more radical that bring in to power ordinary citizens. I don't know. It's very hard to predict the future, so I'm not sure where it's going to start, but it could also just be implemented more readily in organizations that do not see themselves as governments yet, but could, like companies or NGOs or any kind of or or universities or any kind of organization where you need a structure and a governance form, but it doesn't have to be based on election or appointment. It could be also benefit from the diversity that random selection injects. So that said, again, I think that what we're seeing in Europe right now is an attempt by the establishment to regain control of the narrative and prevent social protests and the turn to authoritarianism. So hopefully they'll be bolder. And it's, you know, what gives me a little bit of hope too is what's happening in the US, because in the US, I really thought that after Trump, when we chose Biden, we would just go back to business as usual. And that's not the case. I think the Biden administration is a lot more radical than I thought it would be. So it's possible that our elites are listening, paying attention, learning, and that they might be taking chances, because it's a time or never, actually, this huge crisis we're in to make changes.
Thank you very much. And Florian, I'd also like to ask you a more speculative question about the future of our democracy. So in your article, you talk about how open through Switzerland's direct democracy actually kind of creates an engaged form of citizenship. And you spoke in your last answer about how that might not be accessible to everyone because of nationality, but the principle is there by having these forms that there is for the people that can access them, there is a form of engagement with the politics that might be missing in other places. So do you think that could be transposed to from other countries? Do you think that different ways of doing politics can also bring out a different relationship between the citizen and the political sphere?
Yeah, so you know, if you transpose the Switzerland's story and not the myth and the national narrative that of the good old gentlemen from Uri, Schwyz and Unterwald who allied against the foreign powers who wanted to invade them. If you just put that aside from the 13th century and you look at the post-Napoleon history of these 26, at the time 25 sovereign states somehow coming together, already being somehow related, writing a constitution with direct democracy, and we're in 1848. What binds these people from this country together at that point is, you can really ask yourself, there is no common language, there's no common culture, there is no common religion. The country went through religion wars. The country hosted Calvin and Luther and has from Fribourg, it's the National Guards with the Vatican. And there are quite a lot of historians, political scientists who say, well, what kind of built this sense of one citizenship is actually the fact that people could ally together to defend common interests. And then if you put that in a more modern language, use direct democracy. And still now, what does a place like Geneva, you know, with the UN, very international, half of its population not having a Swiss passport, have in common with a place like Uri? In another country, you'd ask, you know, what does a place like New York have in common with other places in the US, more urban? It is language, culture, and so on, a common history. Well, we don't have all of that, right? Geneva's history has lots of things, but very little to do with Uri's history. So in a way, what has combined, what the combined common heritage of the Swiss people is this right to participate in the shaping of the country without needing to elect people that they send to Bern. Bern was invented as a capital, and we would send our representatives once a year there to negotiate, a little bit like it used to be in the US. And so thinking of that, I'm wondering this concept of the states coming together little by little, you know, enlarging and then finding a size, one leaving, one staying, not the same language, not necessarily the same culture, very different histories, very different national stories also. Maybe that is what what the EU is lacking right now. It is saying we're one. What are you giving to your citizens to actually be one? What makes it that somebody from Hungary can maybe launch an idea with somebody from Portugal, and maybe that link of a possibility of taking in your own hands the shape of the European Union without needing somebody up here telling you how to do it is what is missing now to creating a citizenship. And I'm aware that as a Swiss, we're not, we're very far away from the EU, even further away since the decision of the government of Wednesday to postpone and cancel any kind of talks for a framework agreement between Switzerland and the EU. But I think that this, in Switzerland, us being more aware that there is this past and this history and this way of building a democracy that is the common thing between everybody, rather than saying that it's language, culture, religion, is actually also quite interesting as a concept for the EU. And let me just finish by saying that's why it's so important that people who live here actually have a role in direct democracy. And that's where the far right wing of this country, where you see how their narrative and their play with the Swiss myth is so anti-Swiss. If they'd be really Swiss, they'd know that Calvin, who built the modern Geneva, was actually a foreigner. And now he's on all of the statutes in Geneva. If they'd be really Swiss, they'd know that what matters is when you live here, you participate to building the place. That is what happened, what mattered in Swiss history. And that also, I think, relates quite a lot to what is happening in Europe now with the neoconservatives and with the right wing and their power right now, and their kind of invention of national myths over European common heritage. So that's some reflections. I'm not saying it's the truth. I'm just saying I think there is an element there that could help for kind of foreseeing a future for the European Union.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you a final question, Kata, but before that, I just ask the participants that if you'd like to come in with questions for this final bit, please write them in the chat. You can either write them in as text or ask to switch your mic on, so as you prefer, but yeah, questions are welcome. But before then, Kata, I wanted to return to the end of your last answer, where you were talking about the question of Hungary and the democracy in Hungary kind of really starts with potentially getting a change of government. So I believe that the opposition is more or less united. We're behind one candidate against Fidesz and against Orbán.
Not yet, but soon.
Soon, and Budapest has also elected a Green-backed mayor with a large coalition. So what challenges are there for the Hungarian opposition, and what kind of prospects are there ahead of the elections next year to really kind of change the situation?
Yeah, the pre-elections are actually coming up of these 6 parties of the 7 relevant oppositional parties united, which is a very interesting thing, as in these 6 parties, it's 2 green parties, 2 leftist parties, a neoliberal party, and the former fascist, neo-fascist party is among them, which at these days are more central, as the Fidesz basically executed their program in the previous years. Actually, the surveys right now show that this united front is just as popular among the voters as the Fidesz, so it's like 50-50% basically right now. They want to have one candidate for prime minister for the 2020 elections, and basically in next month there will be a pre-election for the public to decide who they want from this union to run for prime minister. And actually, as I see, there are 2 possible candidates, and one of them is actually the Green Party mayor of Budapest right now. At the same time, I think it's going to be very interesting, and I think that there's a chance that at least the Fidesz is not going to get the 2/3 vote. But at the same time, the Fidesz had this other strategy of changing the election system every 2-3 years in their own favor. And just like a couple of weeks ago, there was a new proposal to change the election system again, interestingly, a year before the new elections. And the new proposal very obviously is focused on this one party, which is not in this coalition, which is the Satire Party. Which is like another very interesting point that party campaigning with free beer and eternal life is basically a threat to the new election from the Fidesz aspect. But on the other hand, just to getting back for these consultations, another very interesting thing is going on right now, as the Fidesz has an agreement with China to build a Chinese university, like a filiale of the Fudan University in Budapest, from a 1.5 billion euro budget out of Hungarian citizens' pockets. Obviously, it's like very contradictory, as the university is under the surveillance of the Communist Party of China, and also like the amount of money that goes in there is going to be a very expensive university. Probably it won't, like Hungarian students won't really have access to the education there. And very interestingly, this is the first time when the oppositional parties are calling for a consultation, because they don't have the time to even like start to collect signatures to call for a referendum. And this consultation will take place between the 4th of June to the 13th of June. It's going to be like, I really have no idea what's going to happen, because it's very likely that the people will be against this investment, and how the Fidesz is going to try to disqualify the results of this vote. But also I think it's going to show power from the oppositional parties at this point. And yeah, I think that I'm a bit optimistic on the Hungarian scale, because the situation is so bad that people, I think there's only like way out of it. Like it can't get like worse than this. And it was very funny when I was reading Helen's paper or the interview, and I was like, first I was a bit like, oh, but this is so difficult. It's such a complex system. But then when I was thinking about like how the Fidesz managed to basically build this like countrywide network of like from up to down, but like really having an effect on each citizen's life, then I was like, yeah, maybe it can be turned around. And actually, obviously not in the next few years, but maybe in the long run, it would be amazing to have a system like that, where actually it gives like more opportunity to people. Because just one more notion about it, it's like the Fidesz is treating the voters in a very infantile way, which is like, I think at one point, I'm not a psychologist, of social psychologist, but I think that people sense that they are treated as unintelligent people who can't even decide between like 2 options or 3 options or comprehend the debate. And yeah, so, and oh, just about what Florian said about this shared European identity and how we can like build something like that. I think it's also from a Hungarian or like other like neo-populist mostly Central Eastern European countries. I think this new identification, which is trying to alienate like national identity from the Western values, or like the belonging to Europe in general, or to the European Union, I think that's also like an extremely important, and I feel like sometimes overlooked symbolic part of politics, as Viktor Orban or Kaczynski or the Polish government, they really use historical validation for themselves, and how basically based on history we are excluded from like the Western discourse, or like they don't understand. And actually this is something that they very greatly benefit from, as we don't really see economic results or political results apart from like this ongoing propaganda, then which can also expand to homophobia, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, anti-women, like basically anti-whatever they choose, they find at the moment to be useful to exclude from the national essence of nation or national identity. Yeah.
Thank you. So I just asked the participants if anyone would like to either come in for a question or Oh, just got one come through from Gavin McCall. So this is a question about Green parties as they become more successful electorally, moving away from other forms of action, was that protest or civil disobedience, for example. And Kevin McCall's asking how members can help change this course. Maybe would you like to come in and ask that question, Gavin? Or should I throw it straight to the... I believe you can unmute yourself if you try. Otherwise, I can pass it straight. Ah, yeah.
No, you can pass it straight over. It's quite long.
All right, thanks a lot. Maybe Florian, you'd like to respond to this one?
Yeah, I mean, thank you very much, Kevin, for the question. I think it's really the challenge of the system. So if your only perceived interest as a political party is to win an election in 4 or 5 years, why would you remain kind of more of movement-based and mobilize people for other interests than your election? I think that is really the kind of the poor side of the representative system. We don't have that challenge because of our realities. But what I see as really important, at least from the Swiss experience, is that we invested for the past 20 years quite a lot in building up what has now become the strongest youth party in the country. And not out of interest, but really out of the belief that it will help the Green Party to remain a place of debate and to remain a place that you actually debate substance and you don't only debate how you will win an election or how you will organize yourself. And I think the youth parties play a huge role in because young people come to political parties to debate the substance. So that's something that we invested in a lot, and that we did, thinking of something very different than thinking of electoral interests.
Any further questions, or if any of the panelists would like to come and react to either that or some of the other things that have been said?
I can just ask a quick question,
Yes.
if that's okay. I just wanted to pick up a bit on what Helen, you were saying about so the fact that in Ireland, where we saw the referendum quite relatively successful, it's still, in several cases, it still had to have kind of the government backing and legitimacy. And this makes me wonder if referendums are always a bit destined to be a tool which is somehow used by governments in power to varying extents. So obviously in Ireland, we're not seeing what we're seeing in Hungary, but maybe there's somehow a similarity in terms of the fact that it will always be somehow a bit helping the government out to reach a certain point. And whether that leaves space for referendums to ever be subversive in any way, or to ever bring about stronger change, for example, the change that we need to see to have an ecological transition and to have action on the climate, and what the conditions would be for that to happen. And I suppose this connects to a bit of a broader question, which we don't have to get into now, but how democracies can be protected, can, on the one hand, open themselves up to external actors, if you like, and to, for example, younger people having paths to power and being able to have a real say that actually leads to something, and yet also protecting our democracies from anti-democratic forces that would try and hijack them, if you like, or turn them into something different by exploiting their weaknesses. Or is this just a paradox of democracy that we're doomed to live with?
Well, it's a very difficult question. Thank you for asking this. So I feel like Florian should also answer, because the lesson from Switzerland is that referenda can be frequent and bring about issues that are not raised by the system, but by citizens themselves. So I think there's a way to use bottom-up popular processes, whether you want to call them citizens' initiatives or, rather than referendum, that is actually empowering and can somewhat escape the sort of bottom-up control and manipulation by government. But in my model, hopefully, if you had instead of elected bodies, randomly selected bodies, there would be a better fit between the legislation that comes out of those bodies and what people actually want. So you wouldn't necessarily have a tension and a sort of mismatch between what majorities want and what they get through the electoral system. So that said, if you look at California, where they also have a system of citizens' initiatives and popular ballots, the lesson there is that there is also the problem of corporations who buy basically outcomes, as we saw with the referendum on whether or not Uber workers are actually employees or it should be salaried, or whether they are independent contractors, and Uber basically managed to sort of with their means to spend enough money to get the outcome that they wanted. So how do you make your system safe-proof against that kind of corporate manipulation? I don't know. My understanding of the Swiss system is that citizens' initiatives are not sort of sent to a referendum right away, but there's some kind of deliberative back and forth with Parliament, where Parliament can either make another proposal, or at least negotiate the terms, so that there's some kind of filter there that's actually useful, that it's a deliberative filter, which you don't have at all in the Californian model. But I actually think Florian should answer that question probably.
Aside, it's a funny story about Switzerland is its military, right? We're a tiny small country in the middle of Europe, and we have a very defensive territorial defense system, and we invest a lot of money into it. And we have a mandatory conscription system that takes 12 months for each Swiss male citizen, and then it's linked to a national myth, a narrative that comes from the 13th century, that every true Swiss man shall have his weapon at home. I'll be very disappointing for all of you because I don't have my weapon right here. I don't own one. But if I'd be a real Swiss citizen, I'd have one. So when you build all of that up and you do it over centuries, one of the worst and most challenging proposal that could come to the system is an initiative that asks to abolish the Swiss military. So if you imagine the whole country was built on that, you'd get a job in a bank, again, another myth, a bank only if you have a certain level in the military. You'd be jailed if you refuse in the military to raise in rank. So my father, for example, was considered that a university professor has to have a certain rank in the military. He said he's not interested. Well, they threatened to jail him. So you have all of this going on. And in 1989, an initiative launched by a group of green leftists and pacifists raised 36 and something % of yes votes to abolish the Swiss army, completely abolish it. That's the most outside of the box idea you could find. And it's brought by really a true popular initiative. No party at the time would dare, and the Green Party was just 5 years old, would dare kind of supporting this initiative. And the reason I'm taking this example is because what then since happened is that you on a regular basis have a challenge to a law, for example, a law to buy military jets. That will be challenged by people, and you'll vote on, should we buy FA-18 from the USA or not? And in a way, even if the initiative wasn't successful from a legal point of view, it's only 36% of yes votes, it was successful because it challenged a national myth. It challenged this whole storytelling. And I think in a way, again, I really want to underline, I don't know if this would work anywhere else, but it works here for groups that are that are considered as outside of what is, you know, what would come to Parliament, what would even be discussed in Parliament. Now, the risk with all of this is that what we saw for probably since the 1920s, where it was a tool of the Social Democrats, of the workers' movement, and then somewhat of the Green movement with the anti-nuclear movement and so on, the anti-army movement. In the last 30, 40 years, it also became a tool for the far right-wing movement. I told about the burqa ban, the minaret ban. There was an initiative willing to say that Switzerland could only have 14% of foreigners. So what would you do? We expel people. And we are now thinking, you know, what kind of framework do we need to give direct democracy? Do we, for example, need to build in that, well, you can have an initiative to change any part of the constitution you want, except the fundamental freedoms, except the catalog of human rights? Do we need to begin building in a sort of protective measures, because democracy has to protect itself against itself? And that is, I think that will be the big challenge of kind of the next generation of the Swiss direct democracy. The more this tool is used by far right-wing movements and populist movements.
Thank you, Florian. We have to wrap up the session imminently, but we do have one final question. Well, there's two questions there, but they're both linked through the question of inclusion. One around Roma people, and the other one from Jean Lambert. What additional practical measures need to ensure people can participate when the possibility is there? And this is obviously a particular issue for Roma communities that are sometimes not well connected to political or system more generally. So I would just ask if any of our participants thinks they could come in on that quite practical question in a couple of minutes, because we really don't have much time, just for a final statement. That would be much appreciated. Please, Kata, come forward.
Yeah, I think I'm from a country where the Roma minority actually is very much present invisibly. As Hungarian populations, like 5 to 10% is estimated to be Roma or belong to the Roma community, and most of these people belong to like the poorest and most marginalized, also like geopolitically marginalized people, and they have a very low agency. Obviously, in the parliament, also with the Fidesz, they have a Roma representative who's like a highly criticized person who doesn't represent Roma people. He's a representative of the Fidesz's symbolic relation to Roma people. They don't really actually do much about integration or helping these people. On the other hand, when I talked about like media representation, since 2015, actually, there was like a huge media platform from scratch, from really bottom up, was established, Dick Television, founded by a private person. And they actually reached over like 200,000 to 300,000 people through YouTube and Facebook. So they actually established a quite big following. And in 2019, basically through media capture, the government took ownership over this like civil initiative, even though that they were not like explicitly political, like this channel. They pulled a couple of campaigns around elections, very simple messages: don't sell your vote, which is like a taboo in the Hungarian election system, that people in poverty exposed to a couple of thousands forints, they would actually sell their votes. And not long after that, through these media oligarchs and some other actors, they took ownership of the first actual medium which gathered and could have give an actual platform for the Roma community to get actually also like political agency, just based on the amount of people following it. yeah, it's just an example of how it's not working.
Okay, thank you. I'll have to close our session now. I'd like to thank everyone for a brilliant, stimulating discussion. If you'd like to read more on the topic, I invite everyone on the call to visit the Green European Journal website, where you can find the latest edition as well as other articles published weekly. All that's left, I'd like to thank our 3 guests for joining us, and all the people that attended this session, and thank the European Greens for having us and all the support staff. And yes, thanks again, and have a lovely afternoon, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye.